Welcome to the Highland Heights Bible class. We are happy that you joined us for our Sunday morning conversation. As always, we're looking forward to being back together in our usual Sunday morning classes, but until then, you're stuck with us. So we're in week 5 of our Apologetics series. If you haven't had a chance to watch the previous videos, you can click down here or click somewhere, and you'll be able to watch those, the preceding videos. Each week we've been covering one topic of an issue that comes up in the Christian faith and trying to wrestle with some of the answers that have been provided and looking to God's Word for what He has to say about it. So this week we're dealing with a sticky subject, something that's not pleasant to talk about, but specifically dealing with the challenge that is brought against the Christian faith of, is our God really worth worshiping if He kills children? So basically this question is thinking through when God does things that seriously offend our sense of justice today, is that a God we can stick with? So Jeremy, help us define the problem. How should we think about this?
Well, this is a problem that in a lot of ways it goes along with something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the problem of evil and suffering. Mm-hmm. Except in this case, we talked the last time we talked about this, it was kind of a, how can God allow evil to exist in the world? Is God to blame? No, in this case, there's no doubt. Okay, God is acting in history in ways that lead to the death of innocents. Okay, and not just people we would consider innocent in the sense of relative to other human beings, but innocent as in children, young children who we would say are not held accountable for their actions. They haven't passed the quote unquote age of accountability yet, and they're being struck dead by the direct action or the direct command of God. The two most often examples of this are what happened to the Amalekites and what happened to the Canaanites. You've got the Amalekites who attack Israel coming out of Egypt, and then later God tells Saul, okay, you go and you wipe them out. Men, women, children, livestock, all of it, gone. I want them gone off the face of the earth. Similarly, when the people of Israel invade Canaan, God tells them, okay, the land is yours, go take it, but you have to wipe out everyone. You destroy now, He does not tell them to destroy all of their physical capital. So not only does God say, destroy everyone, kill everyone, but don't burn the cities, kill them all and take their stuff. You're going to live in cities you haven't built and plant. I mean, this is like, and by the way, we have a word for that. It starts with a G and ends with an inocide. Genocide, right? I mean, and this is...
Thanks for putting those together for us.
Yeah, I knew, Michael, that might cause some trouble for some. This really happened. These are God's instructions. And sometimes people get the impression that the Old Testament is just a blood-soaked divine rampage. It's not actually, okay? In fact, God only orders functional genocide twice. But, with human beings, we don't say, well, it's okay. It was just one genocide. Just don't do it again, okay? World leaders, you're grounded if you do a genocide once. But if you do it again, we're going to have to... We don't allow that, and yet here's God doing it twice. So that's the challenge, because like you said, it offends our sense of justice. We as human beings would not allow that. And here we are proclaiming a God who, to be frank, sounds a lot like the gods that existed around the ancient Israelites. A God who appears to be capricious and cruel and arbitrary. He doesn't care. And this is what people take from the Old Testament, and sometimes from the way it's presented, is this is a cold, capricious God who just wipes people out of us just for the sake of convenience, or because he's upset that day. He wakes up on the wrong side of the cosmic bed and said, you know what? I'm tired of the Canaanites. Wipe them out. Or sends plagues or famines or things, and people die in these things. And let's not make the mistake of saying, oh, this is easy, we can just hand wave this away. This is something that it bothers people, justifiably so. And so we need to think about, okay, how do we square this with the rest of what's going on in the Bible?
Yeah. So, and, as you said, even one would be too many. It's funny that we're recording this just a few days after Wayne talked about in his Sunday morning sermon that he was talking about a debate that he had been in with someone that said that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are different in some way. And Orthodox Christianity, we as Christians believe that no, this is one God. And so from the outside, we will get people who bring up these examples. And it's not just killing people, but there seems to be all of this weird stuff that happens in the people in the Old Testament do things, and it goes against our sense of justice. And many times they do the things, and for example, taking multiple wives, and it turns out quite poorly for them, right? God never told them to take multiple wives, and when they do, it's always bad, always. But in this instance, it's a direct command from God. So it's not as cut and dry as it is when we're trying to explain what are the ethics, what are the morals of these historical events that occurred. So what we have to do is to try to understand why God would have this happen. And I think that one thing that we talked in previous weeks about the God of the gaps, that oftentimes Christians just use God to explain the things that we don't understand yet. I think sometimes we also have an ethical God of the gaps, like, well, his ways are higher than our ways and we just don't understand, so we just have to trust God on this one. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not completely throwing that under the bus. That answer does not fly with a secular audience. If you have a friend at work, school, however you know this person, maybe it's a family member, and you try to say, well, we just don't know why God would do something like that, that is not going to be convincing to them. So we might disagree a little bit tonight, but I think one thing we will agree on is that having some reasoning behind why God's sense of justice is different from our sense of justice is going to go a long way. There will be times where we say God knows things that we don't know, which seems like a bit of a cop-out, but that's actually a point of humility, to say that God's knowledge about the way things will be, or could be at least, is quite different from us. So Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and start kind of walking us through what's some of the basis for why we might believe that God's sense of justice is correct in the scripture that we read.
Well, in the first case, we mentioned a minute ago that the wipe them all out command only happens twice, and again,
wipe everything out. There's plenty of kill these armies.
Yeah, so, not go to war against the army. And in fact, if you examine the old law, the Israelites had very, very strict rules and regulations of warfare. They were supposed to offer an opportunity to the city to surrender. When they marched against a city or something like that, they were supposed to make provision. They were supposed to avoid unnecessary casualties. So there, within the Israelite laws of warfare, it was actually a much more merciful form of war, to the extent that war can be merciful. One of the things I remind my students sometimes is, when you talk about wars in history, this is not a garden party. But
is it Patton that said war is hell?
And you cannot refine it. Patton or Sherman. I don't like saying Sherman's name either, but Georgia boys. So anyway, so to the extent that war can be merciful, their laws were pretty merciful compared to the rest of the ancient world, which brings up for me an interesting question, and that is, okay, God gave them this law that had some pretty strict boundaries about what they could and could not do in warfare. And then with the Canaanites and the Amalekites, he says, okay, taking those shackles off, go get them, wipe them out. So instead of why would God do this in the sense of how could God commit this crime? What's different about these two cases? See, what's special in a bad way about the Amalekites and the Canaanites? And that is where we get into God's sense of justice, God's sense of having a higher view. Our sense of justice is imperfect, like everything else, because we're imperfect and we're sinful. And so we have a tendency to judge what is and is not just based on where we are relative to other people. So I'm better than that person because I live a better life than that person. Well, in the case of God, God is comparing people to himself. And that's a standard that no one measures up to. So when God comes in and looks at these people were completely depraved. One of the Canaanite gods was Molech. Okay, and we're worried about God killing children. Okay, one of the Canaanite gods was Molech, who literally they practiced child sacrifice. Like the idol of Molech was hollow. They'd have this metal hollow statue of Molech. They would build a fire in it, heat that thing till it was red hot, and put a baby in the hands. The hands would be held out like this, and put a baby in the hands. And you can, baby, red hot metal, this is not going to end well. Okay? That's how depraved these people were. In fact, when God tells Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, but Genesis 15, he tells him, your descendants are going to go into exile in another country until the iniquity of the Amorites, that's the Canaanites, is complete. Okay? So this is not a situation of God arbitrarily deciding those people are in the way, wipe them out. This is God's sense of justice coming in and saying, I will not allow this to continue anymore. You think about it, there's about 400 years between Abraham and the conquest of Canaan. The people of Canaan had as long to repent as the distance from today to the founding of Jamestown. Literally the entire history of English settlement, American culture in North America is how long the Canaanites had to realize what they were doing wrong and repent. In the same way, the Amalekites, they saw a group of refugees crossing the desert, and instead of saying, what can we do to help these fellow human beings, they said, we're going to attack them, we're going to wipe them out, we're going to take all their stuff. Why? Because we can. Because they're in the way. So when God, in this case, it is God's sense of divine justice coming in, and instead of raining fire and brimstone down from heaven, he's using the Israelites as the fire and brimstone. When you think of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire and brimstone, okay, same thing going on here. Okay. And so when we think about it in those terms, the question is less why those people and more why not us. Okay. And in that case, it's a situation where God's sense of justice said no more. And you think about it, God is removing these people from being a temptation for the children of Israel, because the children of Israel are the key piece in a much larger plan. Okay. So in a sense, God is protecting from a sinful people the plan of salvation. Okay. Imagine what it would have been like if there had been a remnant of the Amalekites sitting around spoiling for revenge. Okay. And by the way, the king of the Amalekites during the reign of Saul was a guy named Agag. In Esther, we meet Haman, who is described as an Agagite.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, Mordecai and Esther were of the clan of Kish, which was the clan of King Saul. So there are some commentators that think that is a really old family rivalry that's being played out in Esther too. Like, it's not just Haman got irritated at Mordecai. There may be some other stuff in the background too. Similarly, the Israelites do not follow the command with the Canaanites. And look what happens to them in the book of Judges. Yeah. They're led astray. So this God's justice is coming in, punishing sin, punishing where, okay, you may not have my revelation, but you know better than to do this stuff. Romans 1, natural theology. Okay, you may not have had my direct revelation, but there are things you know not to do. Okay. And you did it anyway, so I gave you your chance. Your time is up. It's time for judgment.
I'm one thing you said right there at the end that I think we should spend a bit more time on it, and we've got about 15 more minutes.
Yeah.
Is the Romans 2, kind of explain what's going on there. I want to point us to 1 Samuel chapter 15. So Jeremy earlier was talking about some of our historical knowledge about what the Amalekites did. So what Scripture, God through Samuel says to them in 1 Samuel chapter 15. So this is after Saul has failed to kill King Agag. So I'll start in verse 32. Then Samuel said, "Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." He's thinking he's going to get off, because that's how royalty was. And perhaps one of the reasons that Saul let him off is because when you go around killing kings, usually that means that other people are going to kill you in battle. And so you're just paying forward the favor. Like if I let him go, when I'm in battle, they'll let me go. So verse 33, Samuel said, "As your sword," speaking to Agag, "as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And warning, if you are squeamish or have young children in the room, pause the video now. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. This was the level of punishment that needed to come down on Agag because of the horrendous sins that he had done on his own people, let alone on other peoples in the world. Jeremy, I want you to talk a little bit more about Romans 2 and how we can have some level of accountability there. But also, I think it's important for us to talk about how accountability plays out in a communal setting. So I guess one thing that we're beating around is the original question: why kill the children, right? Yeah. And so one of the reasons why we think that we're imagining, what is God thinking when this is going on? Well, God knowing all possible worlds that could exist, all of the different choices that we could make, God sees that while these children are innocent, to be raised in the culture, in the households of the Amalekites, is it's not a guarantee of living a sinful, awful, horrible lifestyle, but it's pretty close. And when you have a culture that is so depraved, this is the ultimate cancellation, not a restart, a cancellation of what's going on there. And one of my personal beliefs here is that God is essentially doing these children. This is a ghastly thing to say, but God is essentially doing them a favor, in that they do not have to grow up in those circumstances. So anyway, Jeremy, push back there, commentary or thoughts?
Well, I think there is a sense where you're right. There is a I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a favor. I mean, shouldn't I, I've heard people say, well, should we feel bad about these innocent children dying? Yes, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
But this is one of the consequences of sin. I was talking to my daughter recently in school or after school, and I was asking her about her day, and I was like, well, what special did you go to? They have special classes, Spanish, art, gym, music, and there's a fifth one, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But she goes, we didn't get to have our special today. And I'm like, well, why? I knew the answer, but I wanted her to tell me why not. Those boys, okay, apparently the boys in her class are, well, they're kindergarten boys, so yeah, they're rambunctious. And so sometimes it's okay, if you keep doing this, you're not going to be able to go to specials today. And my daughter does not like that very much, and justifiably so. But, one of the things we talked about in very simple terms is when we misbehave, we're not just hurting ourselves. When we sin, we're not just hurting ourselves. So I think you're right. And sometimes people will bring up, when we say, well, God is doing them a favor, they will say, well, you Christians, we bring that up with abortion, that it would be horrible to have these children born into these terrible environments. And you still say, well, you shouldn't have abortion. Well, yeah, because you don't know. God does.
Well, and let me address the abortion comment real quick. We as Christians believe that if a baby is aborted, killed, that the baby is going to heaven.
Right.
It's the sin of the people who are choosing, the father and the mother and the doctor. It is their sin that we are concerned with most of all. Yes, oftentimes I think we make it into a morality play about how we miss. This is getting very gruesome. I apologize, but we make it more about the child. Actually, it's about the sin of the adults in this situation.
Yes.
This is the real wrong that is being done. Yes, there are gruesome consequences, but it is the sin of the adults. And I think too often we make it about the child, perhaps because we're trying to win an argument, saying that this is a real person.
Right.
But we as Christians who are concerned with the sin of the world are concerned with the actual sin that is going on. So, Jeremy, as you're saying, the sin, the consequences of the sin don't only go to that child, but the child's potential children and thousands of generations that are wiped out because of the sinful actions of one person. Anyway.
Well, and to bring let's bring both of them together for a second. The Canaanites, the Amalekites, and what we were just talking about with the issue of abortion. I think he hit the nail on the head about the sin of the sin that's going on in the adults who are charged with a responsibility to care for these children and to raise them, and have committed such horrendous crimes that God says, no. Not only have your crimes condemned you, they have condemned your children as well. Because it is better for them to not have this environment that they're in, right? And so it's, again, let's add this to the list of depraved things. Not only have they warped the minds of, not only have they warped themselves, they're warping the minds of innocent children. Not only have they raped and pillaged and plundered and killed and done all of these gruesome things and treated people so horribly and really, I don't know why that anyone is surprised that these depraved people would earn this response. One of the sayings I have when I teach world history is, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. Powers that come in history and take over and are cruel and vicious and horrible, they'll keep control for a while, but eventually the people they're controlling will rise up and say, you know what, we've got just as much to lose if we don't rebel as if we do, so might as well try it. And so really what they're doing is they're reaping the just consequences. And let's keep that idea of justice foremost in our mind here. They're reaping the just consequences of their action. They made their bed, now they're lying in it. And it's horrible, but one of the consequences of that is it's not just them that are hurt. They have so warped the minds of the next generation that it is better for the next generation and for everyone around them to just go ahead and excise the entire cancer from the body of humanity that these people have become.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Jeremy, can you so everyone's on the same page, develop the idea of why Romans 2 is important for groups like the Amalekites, the Canaanites, who we might think shouldn't be held on the same standard as the Israelites, who had a direct line of communication with God.
Okay. Well, what Paul is doing in the first part of Romans, and if you look at the book of Romans, it's actually all one argument. He is laying out a case throughout the entire book. Okay. And what he's laying out is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All need the redemption of Christ. No one can get the redemption in and of themselves. Everyone is everyone is guilty. Everyone needs God's grace. God's grace is freely given. God's grace should change your life. This was God's intention throughout time. Okay. So at the beginning of Romans, he's kind of got two squabbling groups of people. He's got the Jews and the Gentiles, Jewish and Gentile Christians in Rome, and they're squabbling with each other. And if you like, I could spend 45 minutes laying that out, but I won't. So long story short, you got Jewish and Gentile Christians squabbling with each other. And Paul is basically pricking a hole in both of their senses of self-importance. The Jews, their sense of, we're the people of God, we have the law, we're special. Paul's going, and no, not only are you still sinful, but you had the law, you couldn't even keep it. The Gentiles, who are looking at the Jews as, you're arrogant, you're self-righteous, Jews killed Jesus, yada, yada, yada. Paul looks at them and says, and he actually starts with them, and he says, no, you didn't have the revelation, but there are things that you knew were wrong, and you did them anyway. And if you think about it, that's actually one of the four classical arguments for the existence of God, the moral argument for the existence of God. Long story short, on that one, the moral argument basically says, what is the naturalistic reason for morality? And, we could discuss all of that. But what it boils down to is, in humanity, there is still this sense, by the way, even those that argue that there is no such thing as absolute morality actually believe in an absolute morality. It's just the only absolute truth they'll agree to is that there is no absolute truth, which, if that makes the logic receptors of your brain.
Nothing is certain, not even that.
Yeah, exactly. If that makes the logic receptors of your brain short circuit, you're not alone. Okay. So what Paul is doing is he's saying, okay, God laid out some things in nature that you should have known better, and you did it anyway. Okay. And that's kind of what you got going on is even some of the peoples that lived in the ancient world, had a sense of justice, and they looked at groups like the Amalekites, like the Canaanites, like the Assyrians, and said, no. Okay. In fact, in ancient Egypt, at one point ancient Egypt is like 4,000 years of history. So, but at one point in ancient Egypt, okay, and this, if memory serves, this would have been contemporaneous with Abraham, definitely with Moses. There was a sense of justice. They called it ma'at. Okay. And one of the jobs of the Pharaoh was to do justice, to keep that in balance. And that idea of balance, where things that are evil are balanced out. If you willfully do things that are wrong, then you pay a compensation for that. You see that throughout the ancient world. Law Code of Hammurabi, okay, is a famous example. Okay. So that's written on the hearts of men. It's in there. It's built in. And people who don't recognize that, we recognize that as a psychological disorder. It's either sociopathy or psychopathy, and I can't remember which one is which. But we recognize that as, okay, this is something where the wiring isn't right. Okay. And so there is still a sense of, okay, you may not have the revelation of God, but you still have a sense of, these are ways I should not treat my fellow man. These are ways I should not treat my family. And if you violate it, you will be called to account. You will be held to account for that. And so that's the argument Paul is building in Romans 1. That's kind of what's underlying what God does with the Amalekites and the Canaanites is, you had a sense of right and wrong, and you still violated it.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a figure in the New Testament that talks about your conscience being seared. Okay, and if you've ever done a lot of hard work and had calluses on your hands, I used to work at the FedEx ramp in Memphis, and had I had some good calluses on my hands right here where I would work with boxes and stuff. I didn't wear gloves because it was hot, it's Memphis. But, I could poke at those and not feel it because it was calloused. And that can happen to our conscience too. And that's what happened to the Amalekites, Canaanites, other people and the ancient Israelites eventually. Their consciences became so seared that God said, nope, done.
Yeah. Okay, so we're about out of time. Let's make some closing statements here, and let me request one.
Go ahead.
One thing that we haven't talked about yet, or we should develop more fully. why not? Where does grace fit into this? Where does forgiveness and the love of God and goodness? And let me just introduce one. Why didn't God say to them, kill the men and the women and the oxen, all the animals, and adopt those who are 2 and under? Why is it that how do we put these things together? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting hypothetical. I'm going to go ahead and tell you I don't have a hard and fast answer for why didn't God do it. Okay.
Let me interrupt because I thought about it, so I had a bit more time.
Go ahead.
So the best I can think of here is God knew the horribleness of the Israelites over the next like that generation. Like they're not great either.
Yeah.
And so, God's thinking, well, I could have them raise these children, but they're going to do a horrible job raising their own kids. Once Joshua dies, Israel falls apart. And so that's the book of Judges. And the book of Judges ends with, and everyone did what was right in their own eye. It is messed up. Mm-hmm. The Old Testament is not, as far as man goes, not a success story, right? It is laying the case that grace is needed. Yeah. And so that's the best I could come up with, is that God realizes that it is a dumpster fire on both sides.
Well, and to further develop that thought, just to segue off of that and let's make it bigger again. When we're talking about this, some of what we're doing is we're nut picking is a term where you look at the other side of an issue and you pick the nuts, like the craziest people you can find, and you hold them up as the example. Okay, so in a sense, with these stories of Amalek and Canaan, we're cherry picking, and we're saying, I can't worship a God who would be that vicious and that horrible. And what we have to remember is, again, this is 2 instances in a much bigger story. So you ask, where is grace in all of this? Well, grace is in the same place where we find the importance of God's justice. See, a lot of times we think, well, okay, God is a just God, but why couldn't he just overlook that? Because if he had overlooked it, he would not have been a just God. Do you respect a figure of authority who just hand waves away the rules whenever he feels like it? No, absolutely not. God is justice. Justice demands that sin receive its just compensation, just reward, just punishment, if you want to use that, okay? How important, how essential, how serious is the justice of God? He sent his son to pay the price of justice. And so when we say, okay, you brought up the Israelites, and people might say, well, I mean, God wiped out the Amalekites, and you're saying the Israelites were just as bad, so why'd he let them live? That was grace. It was grace for the Israelites, but more importantly, it was grace for us. Okay? Because it was through Israel that salvation was going to come. It was through the descendant of Abraham that salvation was coming. And so God is protecting the longer term plan. And he's saying, look at the whole story. I can't worship a God who would be this angry and this vengeful. Where is the love? Well, the love is in Jesus. The love is in the fact that God continued the plan even after Israel became so depraved. Okay. And the love ultimately comes down to trust. Okay. Faith. See, when we look at the whole story, we see a God who is constantly working through the failings of man to save us from ourselves. We've talked before, idolatry is self-love. It ultimately is the elevation of self above God. So God is working through the failings of man to save us from ourselves. I see that, okay? We're not always going to find a cut and dried 3 bullet point answer to everything that comes up. Michael, I think you're right about, Israel is so depraved too, but even that is like, I think it's a good answer, but I don't like it that much. And part of the reason I like
not airtight.
Yeah, no. What it says about Israel and all of that. But here's the thing about faith. I know enough about God that I don't have to understand all the what because I trust the who. God is saying, how important is my justice? How important is my mercy? I'm going to send my son to accomplish both. Can you trust me when I do something you don't fully understand? He's willing to send his son. I think God has earned a little bit of trust when we don't completely, we can't put into words our understanding of what God is doing.
I think that's a great place to end. I'll make my closing comment extremely short. For posterity's sake, people are watching this video in the future. No, we're not condoning the killing of anybody. So,
yes,
anyway.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please
all right.
Don't kill people, children or adults.
No one. Okay. God does not give us any specific revelation to do that. Okay. I think that this was a productive conversation, and I think we kind of began and ended on that note of God's justice and how it is best represented in Christ. That's a good thought to go with. So thanks to everyone that has joined in on this conversation. We hope to be able to talk more about it with you in person in the future. But until then, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.